Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. We begin in Shanghai, where French President Emmanuel Macron is on a 3-day visit to China, during which he is expected to attend the second China International Import Expo in Shanghai tomorrow. His second visit to China since taking office, Mr. Macron seeks to take new strides for better cooperation on climate, trade, and agriculture. This year marks the 55th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and France. Ahead of the state visit, the leaders of both countries have pledged to maintain multilateralism while facing global challenges together. Before we get down to our discussion about the bilateral relations and what's the significance of it, take a look at this first.
At the invitation of Chinese President Xi Jinping, French President Emmanuel Macron is going to pay a state visit to China from Monday to Wednesday. As part of the visit, the two presidents will talk about stepping up China-France trade relations. According to French media, the two countries may sign dozens of deals this time. And another issue that is likely to be discussed is climate change, a global concern that both sides can find common ground. The second China International Import Expo is an important stop for President Macron's visit. He will attend the opening ceremony in Shanghai. France is one of the guest of honor countries at this year's CIIE. About 80 French companies have signed up for the exhibition, with a total area of more than 12,000 square meters, including some big names such as Air Liquide, Saint-Gobain, Société Générale, LVMH, Kering, and L'Oréal. More than 50 innovation-themed activities will be held in the French pavilion. The CIIE is a significant platform, not only to improve bilateral trade ties, but also promote multilateral cooperation with China, France, and other countries. Since Mr. Macron took office in 2017, he has held face-to-face talks with the Chinese president every year, part of efforts to grow relations. President Xi Jinping paid a state visit to France in March, and in turn, President Macron will pay his second visit to China.
Expectations on the French president's visit to China. Let's turn to our panelists. In Paris, we have Professor Joab Toker of the American Graduate School in Paris. In New York, we invited Joe Ruette, who is the chairman of the Bridge Tank. And in our Beijing studio, Liu Mingli, Deputy Director of the Institute of European Studies from the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. So, quite a visit, I would say, Professor Toker. How significant this time, the President of France in China and also at the Import Expo?
Well, you know, the diplomatic jargon, the diplomatic language likes to describe those visits before they arrive almost always as very important and particularly important, etc., which is, of course, the case on the French side and I believe on the Chinese side as well. But I would say that beyond those jargon considerations and sort of a polite diplomatic formula, it is perceived as an important one. You know, it's the third visit, the third contact between President Xi and President Macron since President Macron arrived in power about almost 3 years ago. There were visits over European land, there were visits, a state visit of President Macron in China about 1.5 years ago. Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Yi was in Europe just a few days ago, about 2 weeks ago. Things are building up. Now, the fact that it's building up does not necessarily promise and secure the fact that things are going to be handled, because there's a lot of tension also. There are a lot of things at stake, and there are some sort of fragile zones over which we may find that sooner or later there are some problems in terms of the smoothness of the bilateral relations between Beijing and Paris, and more largely between the overall relations between China and the European Union.
I see. Mr. Rouet, is this visit more about the smooth out the differences, or is it more about showing the solidarity?
I'll be very clear. President Macron said he would come to China every year. He's saying what he said. He's doing what he said. The second thing is that, you know, the Chinese people should really consider that President Macron coming to an import-export fair really shows the support to Xi Jinping policy. It's not the custom for a French president. It's not the classic way for a French president to attend external fairs, international fairs. So if President Macron chooses this time and this location, this is to show his support to what he knows to be one of the key, one of the top most important policies by Xi Jinping. There are discussions, there are negotiations still undergoing on the Belt and Road Initiative, which is one of the key issues also for President Xi Jinping. But the other policy which is important for President Xi Jinping, which is rebalance the trade, by going there, Macron shows his full support and full understanding of Chinese internal politics.
I see. Mr. Liu, multilateralism seems to be the catchphrase both countries would love to embrace. Now, is this an occasion for the two to once again emphasize on that point? With that point in mind, what could the two countries, two presidents, be able to do together?
Yes, both China and France are committed to multilateralism. Multilateralism sounds beautiful, but what it really means. I think the 4CAIE, this is the second one, is a good example of how multilateralism works. CAIE is a very important platform for China and international partners to work together for China to import more and for the foreigners to sell more in Chinese market. It's a platform for both China and international partners. And France President, this visit shows that it attaches great importance to this new mechanism, which shows that both countries are attach very good importance to the multilateralism.
Talking about multilateralism and the multilateral platforms, Professor Toker, I'm sure you know that the APEC was cancelled as a result of chaos going on inside Chile, which means the international community lacks one more opportunity of interacting with one another, particularly the leaders of some of the most important economies in the world. Could the gather together of the two presidents coming from China and France, two different continents, two important economies, and also two coming from the permanent members of the Security Council, be able to provide at least some fresh breath, in a way, out of the very pressured situation the world is feeling right now?
Well, I read your question as a wish, and I associate myself with this wish. You're absolutely right.
It's not my wish, but rather I would rather just put a question to
for
you.
world leaders.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay, you know, sometimes reading questions as a wish for ones is a way of answering a question. You're right. The phase in which overall high-level international contacts is not a good phase. These years, this few recent years, it expresses itself, among other things, due to the fact that indeed the occasions for about a dozen most important world leaders to see each other in person are reduced. And the example you mentioned regarding Chile is one illustration. I think that since both President Xi and President Macron are authentically and for a long period of time beyond this shaky, fragile phase in overall international relations, have always been very fighting in the international scene for multilateralism. It's not something that had been invented in order to counter what is happening in international affairs since the arrival of President Trump, since the what the West considers to be Russia's aggressive gestures, for example, since things have become even more complicated in the Middle East, and I can go on the list of crisis zone areas in the world. But this was an authentic ambition, I believe, of President Xi right from the very beginning. And the same goes for President Macron. So chances are that actually things would go this way. Would that be enough to counterpart all the other so-called more negative energy which is poured into the top of the pyramid of international affairs over the last 3, 4, 5 years? I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Well, what can be done? That is probably the most important thing, that both believe in multilateralism when they're gathering together, where there is some energy being sent out from them to the rest of the world, and can they do something together about multilateralism? Probably actions is even better than words.
I think bilateral comes first, then multilateral will come later. I think the cooperation between the two sides will send a signal, example to others. You know, France, I think, is the most important Western country to attend the CIIE this time. If there are a lot of achievements for France, also as well for China, I think there will be example for other Western countries to rethink about this mechanism. I think there will be a spreading effect for Macron's visit. I think after this visit, if there is a lot of deal which could be signed, other countries may think maybe there will be more Western countries to attend the third round of CIIE maybe next year.
I like your swift turn from multilateralism to bilateral relations, Mr. Liu. But let me go to you, Mr. Rouet. So there was the question earlier asking whether President Macron is in China for Europe or is in China for France. What do you think?
Well, he's in China for both, and because I really agree with Mr. Liu that a sound, balanced multilateralism will be built off of regained trust from bilateralism. You know, multilateralism is a word, but the multilateralism American way used to be disbalanced, and what we need is to have rebalanced multilateralism. We'll rebalance the trade, we'll rebuild the trust bilaterally with France and with Europe, because Macron wants to build a new Europe. Now it's even a possibility that the UK, as the UK will most likely sooner or later exit Europe, and some countries led by France will want to have a more rebalanced position in the world and deeper bilateral trade with China. So I agree with Mr. Liu is that you have let the bilateral agreements multiply, let those agreements be more balanced, and then we have a chance for balanced multilateralism.
Do you like that sequence, Professor Toker? Bilateral first and then multilateralism.
I would say that the notion of bilateralism is not pure, and as well as the notion of multilateralism. There are considerations which are Europeanly inspired in the way France and President Macron leading their foreign policy initiatives and their commercial initiatives. And things are not simple. Europe is not one bloc. The EU position is not a homogeneous one. As a matter of fact, it's less homogeneous now than it was 2, 5, or 10 years ago. Things are getting more complicated as the British are on their way out one way or the other, as my colleague just mentioned. So whenever President Macron is up to a gesture or an initiative or a reaction to a gesture which may come from the Chinese way, then of course he's the president of France, and the bilateral reflexes would have priority.
I see.
But by doing that, he has a EU component, an inbuilt one, a constant one in the way he makes and shapes his foreign policy. So the question is more blurred than just straight through one.
Of course, German Chancellor Angela Merkel made many trips to China, including the recent one just a few weeks ago. Mr. Liu, you see powerful German and also French presidents and prime minister coming to China, chancellor coming to China on a frequent basis.
Yes, German Chancellor knows China very well. She visits China almost every year. And for French President Macron, he also promised to visit China every year, and his promise has been honored this year with the visit, which shows that both Germany and France, as the two engines of the European Union, attach great importance to China. These two countries work together to a large extent. They can dominate the policies of the European Union. I think though we see some different views in the European Union because it's a bloc of 28 member states, we still say the mainstream is a pragmatic policy towards China.
Of course, it has a lot to do, Mr. Liu, with the economic structure, how it's been evolving in two economies. But what exactly can be done from both sides in order to narrow down the trade deficit? Now, China, of course, is trying to show its responsibility to the rest of the world by doing imports, but China could only import to the extent that it needs. So, Mr. Liu, how much pragmatic expectation people should have about narrowing down the trade deficit?
Personally, I don't think the trade deficit between European Union and China is a big issue.
European Union or friends with China?
Yes, both European Union and France have trade deficits with China. But if we take the European Union as a whole, at the global stage, the trade is balanced for the European Union. And for Eurozone, they also enjoy the trade surplus. So trade deficit is not a serious challenge for the bloc of the Europe. And yes, there are trade deficits between China and the European Union. But the reason is that there is a distribution of labor in Asian market. There is a trade deficit between EU and China, but the trade between European Union and Asia is balanced. So from perspective of European Union and from perspective of EU and Asia, I think the trade is generally balanced.
Mr. Rouet, do you also subscribe to that kind of comparison, French perspective?
Well, yeah, two things, the French in particular, but the Germans as well, understand that, the EU was built on what we call competitive markets. Now, this notion of competitive markets, which especially prevents from large industrial alliances, on the long run has impeached us to have some competitive advantage in some industries. As we are redeveloping new industries, new technologies, I think the technological link will go along with trade link. The more companies know each other, the more they will trade together. Trade is intra-value chain. So what is interesting with the Shanghai event is that technology is not absent. It's industries which meet at Shanghai. Unlike in Guangzhou, it's buyers and sellers. The Shanghai DNA is different from the Guangzhou DNA.
That's
and this
true.
is what President Macron has understood as well, that given the structure of the French industry and the German industry, Shanghai is a bigger event for us.
If you look at what can be done between the two economies, that of China and that of France, and also some of the positive cause they could create it for the rest of the world. For example, about climate change, the issues of climate summit later in the year, if there were any. Mr. Rouet, very briefly, can be done much between China and France this time?
Very briefly, in 2015, China helped Paris to make the Paris summit a success.
Yeah.
So I think next year, France and Paris should do everything they can to help China make the biodiversity summit a success.
I see. Professor Toker?
You've helped us, we should help you.
I would express a wish regarding the meetings between President Xi and Macron and the visit of French President in China over the coming days, which is to surprise us. Excuse me for putting it this way. Let it go behind the signature of what is promised to be about a $40–50 billion agreement. Yes, it could be in the domain of climate change, as the intentions of both China and France in this domain are very much alike. Let them surprise us.
Okay, Mr. Liu, also about climate change issue, do you think there's much initiative to let the two work together? On what?
For this visit, I think I would expect more deals will be signed through this visit. That will help to narrow
about climate change?
For the climate change, I think that will a long-term issue. But this visit with deals that will enhance the political trust between the two sides, and in the long term, it will help to mitigate the climate change.